Hello, and welcome to the Epsilon Omega podcast, where I talk about certain video games and how they've changed the industry. My name is Joseph Rayo, and I'm a game designer for Epsilon Omega Studios, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Half-Life series. So, my introduction to the Half-Life series was through Ross Scott's internet series, Freeman's Mind. Hilarious series. If you never heard of it, go look it up. I absolutely love it. Still good to this day. And in the series, he gives the game's protagonist, Gordon Freeman, thoughts as he progresses through the game storyline. And eventually, after hearing how good it was from other friends, I ended up playing through Half-Life 2 and loved it. Absolutely loved it. The stories in the games that I played up until that point had been mainly told through cutscenes, and it was interesting to play a game where, one, I was in control the entire time, and two, if I didn't pay attention to what the characters were saying, I'd be missing out on the story of the game. And as such, I had always planned to go through Half-Life, the original Half-Life game, Half-Life 1. But it was many years later when I actually did, and when I did, I was amazed. I came to the realization about the story of the game being more about what the player makes it. How you play Freeman changes the story you're told. You can listen carefully to everyone, help the scientists and security out in Black Mesa, or you can not pay attention to what people around you are saying, let everyone fend for themselves, and just kind of make your way along. And that, the player defines the character of Gordon Freeman. And one of the parts of my playthrough that helped me realize this was towards the end, right before the last chapter, you're given a room to stock up for supplies before you head out, while some characters give you some exposition as to what you're about to do and how to use a long jump module. And my Freeman at this point was too busy looking around for more ammo to pay attention to what they were saying, and as a result, he kind of forgot how to use the long jump module. And so, of course, he eventually remembered after I looked it up. But that's part of the story of my playthrough. Gordon Freeman forgot how to use the long jump module. Can you believe that? A theoretical physicist who went to MIT forgets how to use the long jump module. What a man. So, I'm going to get into the development of Half-Life and a little bit of the history of Valve. So, Valve was formed in 1996 by two former Microsoft employees, Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington. Half-Life would be their first game, and was built upon a modified version of the Quake 2 engine by id Software, known as the Gold Source engine. You might know id Software from their popular game Doom. Very interesting. Popular first-person shooters at the time were, Doom and Quake were like big influences. So there was a ton of Quake clones out there. One of the ones that comes to mind for me, at least, is Hexen 2, or Hexen and Hexen 2. They're very different from Doom and Quake, but they're also very similar. And I think it's important to go into the influences beyond video games for Half-Life. And so I think it's important to go into the influences beyond games. So Stephen King's novel The Mist and an episode of The Outer Limits called Borderlands were big influences on Half-Life's story. And really quickly, I'm going to go through Half-Life's story as well. So Half-Life, the story to the game is you're a scientist working at a facility called Black Mesa. Kind of like Area 51, but probably more secretive. So Black Mesa, you come into work and you're doing this experiment, and the experiment goes wrong and opens up a portal that allows aliens from another dimension to come in and take over the facility. And you have to fight your way through these aliens to get out of the facility, and you're met with a bunch of challenges along the way through different big enemies and through the military coming in trying to cover up their mess that they've made. So The mist revolves around strange creatures from a different dimension coming into our dimension from a secret military project. Similar? I think yes. And the Outer Limits episode Borderlands story involves a group of scientists using a strong magnetic field to open up a door to a new dimension. Also, very similar. So, that was the story they were going for with the game. And I think they did a really good job of keeping it to that kind of style that they were going to. So, 1996, Valve's like, hey, we want to make this game called Half-Life. We want it to have... They were really ambitious with it. We want it to be all scripted sequences. The player has control the entire time. We want skeletal animation systems, advanced AI. And so they set out looking for a publisher, and nobody wanted to help them out. Nobody wanted to publish it for them. They thought they were too ambitious. It was beyond what they were going to be able to do until they emailed out to Sierra Online, who took their pitch and they were like, yes, we are looking for a 3D something in the 3D shooter genre, and we want to partner with you. So Valve finally found a publisher for Half-Life and began production. E3 2007 comes around, and Valve shows off an early version of Half-Life demonstrating the AI systems that other publishers said they weren't going to be able to do, and skeletal animation systems that other publishers thought they weren't going to be able to do, and the press was blown away by it. It was something that nobody had ever seen before, and it was just all new. And despite not really having much else of a game other than the demo that they showed, they won Best Game of the Show, and understandably, because the rest of the games that were out there at the time were Quake clones. Half-Life brought something completely new to the table with what they were showing off there. Of course, not everyone was enthusiastic about it, as some of the press. John Carmack, who you might know from id Software, being one of the founding fathers of Doom, was skeptical about it, and wasn't really excited by the screenshots or the early showings of it that they released. I think it's honestly that, like, that game developer, he knows what's going on. He knows they got nothing, and that they still got a lot of work to do. So that as well. Not everyone was like super into it. Thought they were in a little over their heads. So with all the good press behind them, they wanted to try and get the game out in time for the 1997 holiday season, and realized that getting it done by then would mean cutting content for their game. So they had a tough decision to make. Pushing it off then could hurt Sierra, their publisher Sierra, as well as them, from selling the game. But in the end, they ended up making the decision to push the game's release date so that they could make the game into what they wanted to be and not cut content. And I think this shows a lot about Valve as a company. That day one, they didn't want to sacrifice getting a game out on a certain timeline to have it be something they weren't as interested in. Something they weren't as in love with. And I think that's something that's very admirable. I mean, one of the things nowadays that Valve's known for is not being able to count to 3. And they get a lot of flack for that. And while I do think they could be a bit more communicative about what they're working on, I do also understand they don't want to be talking about things that might not ever happen. For example, Half-Life 2 Episode 3. At least yet, we don't really know for sure. It could be in the works. So, I mean, that just shows their commitment to creativity that they have, and that they refuse to put something out that they think is subpar. And that's something to aspire to. I think that's definitely something to aspire to, and they've been that since day one. So the whole Half-Life 3 thing, while it is very, very different situation than Half-Life coming out a year later, I think it's also I mean, it's all based on the same principle that they don't want to put out something that's subpar, that's not what they intended the end product to be. So, to get back onto the development of it, pressure's out of the way. They're not cutting costs to get to the 1997 holiday season. They took the liberty to scrap most of their work. And as such, they needed a new designer for the game, and nobody wanted to step up. No one person wanted to step up, so they ended up creating a team of 6 people across a couple of different departments that slaved over this 200-page design document detailing every single aspect of the game, as well as a 30-page document detailing the story, which aided by Mark Laidlaw, who's a novelist, a writer. Actually, I know from the one of the articles that I read to help write this that he was learning from them as well as helping them tell a better story, which I found very interesting. So, a month after the team's formation, they began developing the game, and a month after that, they started playtesting. So they're unique to they're unique. Their approach to playtesting was let the player play the game, watch them play it, and note where they get confused or if they're unable to solve a puzzle in the game. This allowed them to identify and remove the parts of the game that were unenjoyable. And one of the programmers, actually a bit of a, how do you say it? A bit of a one of the best programmers at the time, Birdwell, one of the programmers of the game, thought that it was critical to the process of Half-Life's success. And as such, it was used in a couple of other later titles, including Team Fortress 2. And after that, after the whole development process, Half-Life released the game November of 1998 to critical acclaim. And the rest is history. So, I'm gonna take a second here to not a second. I'm gonna talk about the gameplay and how it changed gaming as a whole in this section. So, I think it's important to look at games that came out around the time when Half-Life was released. So, Quake 2, Hexen 2, Tom Clancy Rainbow Six, and Delta Force were all big titles that came out then. Quake 2 being a staple of the first-person shooter genre. Mission-based objectives, early CGI cutscenes. Rainbow Six and Delta Force, also innovative in their own way to the first-person shooter genre, being some of the earliest tactical shooters and creating a whole new genre, honestly, where instead of running around in circles shooting at people, if you get shot once, you die. That's it. Mission restart. You have to think through everything you're doing. It's a completely different vibe to Quake 2. Hexen 2 also at the time was also another kind of Quake clone, although with a very different style to it. Very different style. Not really a huge first-person shooter kind of game. Very, very Doom-like, Quake-like, but also different style to it. So the main thing that let Half-Life stand out among all the other games at the time was its use of scripted sequences to tell the game's story instead of cutscenes. So in a world where everything, all the plot is given through short little movies, cutscenes, they said, no, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to have scripted sequences where other NPCs in the game talk and tell Gordon what's going on in the game. And so because of that, the player loses control, I can think of once throughout the entire game. And it makes sense within the game because when you do lose control, you are getting knocked out. So it completely makes sense within the game's story. So throughout the whole game, it's up to the player to decide how you want to view the bits of the story that you're given. And another big thing was, instead of having like levels where you play through a level, you finish it, you go to the next level, Half-Life had chapters. And I know you're saying, like, okay, what's the difference? Is there really a difference? And yes, but I mean, you could just call missions or sections chapters. So the game was all one whole section, split up between the occasional pause of a loading screen. You could go through the entire world without being brought out to a menu. Complete immersion, which was unheard of, unheard of at the time. The industry was full of, where immersion was cut off by cutscenes, menu screens, mission screens. This style of game was something completely new. In addition, like, the realism. Now, when you say realism nowadays, it's a completely different thing. But that's because, so Quake, around the time Quake 2 happened, around Quake's time, Doom's time, all of that, like, guns were floating around. Half-Life put guns on tables in realistic locations where they'd be, and that was something completely new, rather than just like having them floating around in the air. That's something completely new at the time. Logic regarding the game's items was also a big thing too. The HEV suit and jump module serve an actual purpose in the story, rather than just being random power-ups. So the HEV suit, it makes sense. It makes sense in the story of the game. It makes sense that there's a Geiger counter in it. It makes sense that it's a suit that's designed to protect you from other types of, like, energy and whatnot. It makes sense because you're working in a place where that is what you need protection from. As opposed to the easiest example for me to think of is Super Mario Bros., where Super Mario Bros., one of the power-ups, the power-ups in Super Mario Bros. Are like, there's a mushroom and it makes you bigger, and there's a flower and it helps you shoot fire. The items have no respect to what they do. There's no there's no sense to it. Half-Life's items make sense within the game's story, and that was a big thing at the time. The AI as well, also ahead of its time. The best way for me to explain it is, if there was an NPC hiding behind a box, throwing a grenade at the NPC would cause them to run away from it. As the same with you, if you were hiding in one spot for long enough, they'll throw a grenade at you to get you to come out. It was something that changed how you fought your battles. And as well as that, like, the pacing of the game, I think, also changed with that as well. Because when you have a game, so some of the enemies are just mindless zombies. Some of the enemies just walk up to you and melee you. That's the headcrab zombies. And then some of the enemies will shoot at you from afar, the military soldiers. And those soldiers, because of the way that they interact with you, it changes how you deal with them compared to a headcrab zombie. You wouldn't treat a headcrab zombie the same way that you treat soldiers shooting at you, throwing grenades at you behind boxes. It's a completely different ballgame. So it moved gameplay away from, like, strafing around your enemies, shooting at them, and shows the player that, the different enemies in the game have to be approached differently. So, in addition, last thing I'm going to talk about is the puzzles of the game. The puzzles in first-person shooters, they've been a big part of them. You can think back to some of the first-person shooters were, not even shooters, but first-person games were like maze games, where you'd be going through a maze and figuring out how to get through it. And Doom brought that to a maze where you collect keys to open doors. And Half-Life took it from a place where instead of doing fetch quests, go find this key, open up this door, it's getting past these tentacles. And for those of you that have not played Half-Life, you're like, what is he talking about? So the tentacles, the tentacle part of the game is the tentacles are blocking a path that you need to get through. And they're these things that you cannot kill. And if you make any noise, they will instantly kill the player. So you have to sneak around them when you're getting through there and use grenades or other things that make noise to attract them away from you to get around them. And in addition, the entire time you're going around trying to set up pieces so that you can turn on this rocket propulsion test to kill them. And this was something that was like never thought of before. This was, or at least not never thought of, but at least never done before. And this changed how puzzles and games were to be thought of into the future, which is something amazing to me. This and with that, the story of the game, having the story be set up through having the game show you a story through a scene where there's a dead body, a head crab zombie, that tells a story that isn't directly told to the player through plot lines. And I think that has had a huge impact on the game, on the game going forward with it. And on other games going forward with it. So now I want to get into the effects on the industry. And I think one of the biggest effects on the industry was through modding, without a doubt. And so I'm going to quickly go through the Half-Life mods, Half-Life and Half-Life 2 mods, that ended up becoming retail games. So, Counter-Strike, Day of Defeat, Team Fortress, Ricochet, Sven Co-op, The Ship, Black Mesa, Dear Esther, I think I'm saying that right, Dino D-Day, Gary's Mod, The Stanley Parable, and Portal. That list, I think, really speaks for itself. That they through this one game, through modding support, through allowing players to play with it and change it how they want, they created a ton of new games with it, even without them directly making the games. Of course, a lot of these were picked up by Valve eventually. Portal, Counter-Strike, Team Fortress, Gary's Mod. I don't know if Black Mesa was picked up by them, to be honest. But a lot of these were picked up by them eventually. And I'm sure that was a huge thing for the people who made them. So Valve created something that people were easily able to modify, create new experiences with, and go beyond their own ideas of go beyond the ideas of the people working at Valve were able to create, and made tons of new experiences for the players of the game. And I think the legacy of the mods becoming full-fledged titles honestly speaks for itself. And among that, the way that they told their story through this game influenced a ton of other games to come. And I've already kind of touched on that, like the scenes with the dead bodies, the head crab zombies. It tells us something. It tells us a story without directly telling us. And that's one of the things that is really powerful in film. I know watching film critics who are critiquing bad movies, they'll say, don't tell us, show us. And I think that goes a long way with video games as well as a medium for telling stories. So to reiterate on that with future games, I know with this is where instead of cutscenes, set pieces in games happen. Instead of taking away from taking away control from the player to tell your story. You tell the story to the player while they're still in control. That is commonplace in modern games. And I mean, thinking about like Halo 3. So one of the there are cutscenes, there are big set piece cutscenes that happen, but there's also a lot of stuff that happens while you're there. Like the scarab battles, those are big set pieces that could be cutscenes, but they decided to not have them be that. And the player decides whether or not they want to look at the scarab while it's exploding or walk away from it and not look at it like a badass. And I think that's something that type of storytelling is something that's been in games ever since then. As well as that, the puzzles in the games have changed. I think of like RPG quests as well with this category. Dark Souls series, a big one. A lot of puzzles in that game. Puzzles while fighting bosses. The bosses. It's also another one where there's very little cutscenes. There's an intro cutscene, an outro cutscene, and cutscenes to show off the bosses when they first come out. And so that's another series that also doesn't take away players' control very often. In addition, also the Portal series is also a big puzzle. It's a big puzzle game that gives you a tool that you can use to solve these puzzles, doesn't tell you how to do it, and you just have the goal to get to the end. And that I think is a big result of the way that they changed how puzzles are done in video games. So they move puzzles from picking up keys to open doors to how do I get around this enemy that's too big to kill? And that's a huge change. That's a huge change. Or how do I kill this very unique enemy that has a very specific way of murdering me? I think of the hunters in Halo. There's the way that you deal with hunters. You can go at them head on and it'll work eventually, but there's easier ways to do it than just hitting them head on. And to continue with the Halo thing, the AI evolving combat is a big thing. Combat in first-person shooters. The Halo series, again, uses really advanced AI combat systems where they say themselves, each time you play the game is going to be different. And I think that's something that's been heavily influenced on how Half-Life did AI for shooters. Every time that you play Halo, either on a different difficulty or just a second time with the same difficulty, the enemies are not going to do the same thing every time. And it's I think that's what makes the game really interesting and helps with replayability. So to get back onto the immersiveness factor, where the story is told through scripted events, of course, Halo, other things where there's set pieces where after you kill enemies in a certain area, they'll drop you off a warthog and you go through and help out other people. That's a big set piece. That's a storytelling element that happens while the player is in control. And that's another thing. But one of the games that I wanted to cover also with this was the Borderlands series, who actually, funny enough, they're made by Gearbox Software, which actually also worked on a couple spin-off games for Half-Life as well as the Halo Combat Evolved PC port. Borderlands, which is their own series, is another game that doesn't take the player out of gameplay to tell its story. It has a intro cutscene, an outro cutscene, and it has cutscenes to introduce the player to new characters. Other than that, it's on you to listen to what's going on. And they'll either tell you while you're there or tell you over the radio. And that is something that's come from Half-Life as well. Or at least Half-Life was the first to do it. So that is like the impact that Half-Life has had on the gaming industry is insane to me. It's gone past it stood the test of time as to what they've added into the games, and it's still things that are added to games nowadays. And I think that really says a lot about it. But with that, that's going to wrap up this episode on Half-Life. If you have suggestions for a game series that influence gaming history, be sure to leave them in the comments below. Although chances are they might already be in the works. If you guys have enjoyed this podcast, be sure to leave a like on the video. It's free for you. It helps me know people are enjoying it, as well as helps get it to other people out there who would also enjoy it. And with that, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.